Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into, well, one of history's most profound and just heartbreaking paradoxes.
It really is.
We've got this unique stack of source material documenting a people, Israel, who were specifically chosen, prepared, and molded for over 1,000 years.
An entire religious existence dedicated to awaiting one central figure.
Exactly. And yet, when that figure arrived, they failed to recognize him. Or worse, they rejected him entirely.
And that staggering disconnect is the exact tension we have to analyze today. I mean, the sources make it undeniably clear.
They do.
Here was a nation whose brightest hopes were enshrined in everything, every song, every prophecy, every single rite they practiced, all of it pointing toward the Savior's coming.
And when the moment came,
they knew him not.
It's just stunning. And not only did they miss him, but the rejection was based on a perceived lack of stature. We see this quoted from Isaiah, right?
Yes, that there was no beauty that they should desire him.
And then, of course, there's that incredibly stark summary in John. He came unto his own, and his own received him not.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace that, to look at the precise historical path.
How did it get to that point?
Right. How was the original divine mandate gradually warped century after century into this rigid framework that almost guaranteed they would fail to recognize him?
It's a study in spiritual distortion, really. We have to look at the intention versus the implementation.
Exactly. What was the original contract?
Yeah.
How did they depart from it so early on? And how did centuries of, political pressure and institutional corruption lead to the specific expectations that blinded them?
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the constitutional level.
Right.
What was the original job description for Israel? They were chosen, yes, but for what?
Well, they were chosen to be preservers, and this is a crucial part, disseminators. Their fundamental role was to preserve the knowledge of God's law, of course.
And not just the law.
No, not just the law. Even more importantly, to safeguard the spiritual symbols and the prophecies that were all signposts pointing directly to the Savior. They were designed to be wells of salvation to the world.
That's such a great phrase. So if they were a bank, they weren't supposed to just lock the treasure away.
Well,
they were meant to be a universal currency exchange, a kind of spiritual distribution network.
Precisely. And this universal intent is baked into the promises from the very, very beginning. You look at the promise to Abraham.
In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed.
There it is. It's not exclusive. They were intended to be as a dew from the Lord among the nations. The sources even remind us that the temple in Jerusalem was meant to be explicitly an house of prayer for all peoples.
Not just for them.
For everyone.
And the sources are quite clear that if they had actually fulfilled this mission, being this spiritual light instead of an isolated nation, the rewards would have been profound.
Oh, absolutely. Deuteronomy lays it out. The consequence of faithfulness was that God would have made them high above all nations in praise and honor.
So a global model of wisdom, a living, breathing testimony.
But as history shows, the deviation started almost immediately. Where do the sources point to as that first major pivot away from the mandate?
It starts with defining success incorrectly, doesn't it?
It does. From the time they entered Canaan, the focus it shifted. It went away from being a spiritual light. They fixed their hopes on worldly greatness.
They wanted political status, national dominion.
Yes, they adopted the trappings of the very heathen nations they were meant to illuminate.
And that fixation on worldly power, on being politically high above all nations, must have poisoned the well right from the start.
It did.
Because it means their definition of the future Messiah was already being filtered through a political lens, not a spiritual one.
It fundamentally twisted their entire perspective, because they kept chasing after the ways of the heathen, ignoring warning after warning from the prophets. Every attempted reformation was followed by deeper apostasy.
And the result was that God's original purpose, which was never rescinded, had to be accomplished differently.
Right. It had to be accomplished through, as the sources put it, continued adversity and humiliation instead of through national exaltation. And that brings us to the ultimate corrective measure.
The Babylonian captivity.
Exactly.
Which is such a fascinating historical moment because it seems to be this mixed success. The sources are definitive that the captivity cured them of one thing.
It did. The worship of graven images, the visible sin. They came back home without their idols.
But here's the paradox you mentioned earlier. While the people of Israel were humbled and scattered in suffering, the light of truth actually shone out more brightly to the world.
More than it ever had when they were organized and successful. It's incredible.
So they only became effective missionaries when they were captives.
Yes. You see figures like Daniel in the courts of Babylon. You read that God brought his servants before kings and monarchs, forcing the greatest world powers to acknowledge the God their captives worshipped.
A global reach achieved through humiliation.
And the spiritual ripple effect was enormous. We read that even sincere observers of heathen rites, seeing the Hebrews, began to grasp the true meaning of the temple service and, critically, the promise of a Redeemer. The truth spread globally because Israel was scattered and powerless.
So, okay, they stopped worshiping stone statues, but when they returned home, the motive for their newfound obedience had completely shifted. They cured the visible idolatry, but what was the new internal corruption that replaced it?
Selfishness and isolationism. Their obedience was no longer prompted by love for God or a desire to bless the world.
It was transactional.
Completely. A means of attaining that old, failed goal of national greatness. They figured if they were just meticulous enough, God would grant them political dominance.
And this shows up in how they treated their mandate for separation. God told them not to associate with idolaters to keep from adopting bad habits.
But they completely misinterpreted this spiritual defense. Instead of using it as a shield for purity, they turned it into a weapon of exclusion.
They built that wall of separation.
An impenetrable wall between Israel and all other nations. The sources are blunt here. They became jealous lest the Lord should show mercy to the Gentiles. They had reversed the promise to Abraham.
Jealousy of God's mercy. That's a devastating spiritual failure. And after the captivity, this insular, selfish obedience hardens into the institutional structure, right? They set up schools and synagogues to teach the law. How did those become compromised?
By the importation of ideas. They didn't bring back the physical idols, but they brought back heathen ideas and customs they had absorbed.
And they mixed them into their religious instruction.
They did. But the most significant corruption was the loss of focus on the spiritual meaning of the ritual service itself.
Which was the whole point. The sacrifices, the feast days, they were meant to be alive, a living symbol of Christ.
Exactly. It was all supposed to continually point to the Redeemer. But the Jews, they lost sight of that life-giving message. They focused entirely on the dead forms.
They started trusting the sacrifices and the ordinances themselves.
Believing that performing the ceremony was the source of salvation rather than trusting in the Redeemer to whom the ceremony pointed.
This is where it gets so analytical, because the spiritual life was gone, that sense of genuine connection. The priests and rabbis felt they had to fill the vacuum with something tangible.
Right.
So what did they use to substitute for that lost spiritual vitality?
They manufactured complexity. They began multiplying their own requirements.
If not God's requirement.
No, their own minute and incredibly burdensome rabbinical precepts. They did it to substitute for the lost spiritual life. They started measuring their holiness not by internal change, but by the sheer multitude of ceremonies they could meticulously perform.
So the key insight here is that complexity became a substitute for actual holiness. But for listeners who might not be steeped in this history, what do these rules actually govern?
Oh, everything. They went so far beyond the Ten Commandments, they were detailed legalism for every facet of daily life.
Like what?
For instance, restrictions on cooking or lighting fires on the Sabbath. They defined exactly how far a person could walk on the Sabbath day's journey.
Wow.
They had minute procedures for washing hands before meals, differentiating between types of water, types of vessels.
They took simple requirements and multiplied them into thousands of tiny injunctions. It must have been impossible to keep track.
It was impossible. The sources state that due to the sheer volume of these human-made rules, it became literally impossible to keep the law. Anyone sincerely trying to serve God was toiling under a heavy burden.
They could find no rest.
Absolutely no rest. And the tragic consequence of this religious rigidity was internal decay. The more scrupulous they were about the forms, the less love of God was manifested.
Their hearts became filled with pride and hypocrisy.
And they created a system that made God look like an unreasonable taskmaster.
Which, the source material notes, Satan then capitalized on.
He did. He used the situation to discourage the people, to bring Israel's faith into contempt, arguing that God's requirements were unjust and couldn't be obeyed. This spiritual rot just. It made the people ripe for massive disappointment when the Messiah finally came.
And this internal decay was happening alongside utter chaos on the political front. As we get into the time frame of Christ's arrival, the nation was just chafing under the oppressive Roman yoke.
The political environment was toxic. The Romans had claimed the right of appointing and removing the high priest.
So the spiritual heart of the nation.
That sacred office was often secured by, and the sources say this, fraud, bribery, and even murder.
That's not just institutional decay. That's total spiritual bankruptcy at the highest level.
Yep, it is.
It makes it impossible for the average person to trust the system. The priests who were supposed to be spiritual leaders were often just mercenary politicians.
Exactly. So between the crushing taxation from Rome and the merciless, selfish demands of their own corrupt priesthood, there was widespread discontent, violence, distrust.
And profound spiritual apathy.
Yes. They were just desperate for deliverance.
They were certainly longing for the Messiah, but because of all those centuries of defining success in terms of worldly greatness, they had no true conception of his mission.
None whatsoever. They were looking for a conquering king, a military liberator who would kick out the Romans and establish universal dominion for Israel.
They were seeking deliverance from foreign masters.
Right. They were not seeking redemption from sin.
And this is the crucial distinction, isn't it? They were studying the prophecies, the very blueprints of the Messiah, yet they fundamentally misinterpreted them. How did their pride and political agenda twist the texts?
Well, they engaged in extreme self-serving cherry-picking. Jewish prophecy had two distinct themes for the Messiah.
Right.
You have the suffering servant, the image of humility, sacrifice, redemption. And then you have the conquering king, the image of glory, judgment, and dominion.
And they desperately needed the conquering king to fulfill their nationalistic, anti-Roman hopes.
So their rulers, who were thirsting for power, and the priests, clinging to their reputations. They just consciously overlooked the prophecies that spoke of Christ's humiliation.
The first advent, they just filtered them out.
Completely. They took all the prophecies detailing his glory, the second coming, and misapplied them entirely to his first arrival. They only saw what confirmed their existing selfish desires for political power.
So what does this all mean when we add it up? We start with a people chosen to be a dew from the Lord, a blessing to all nations. We end with a rigid, legalistic nation drowning in impossible rules run by corrupt leaders focused only on military independence.
If we synthesize this, the sources show a tragic and consistent mechanism of failure. This was a community whose outward religious adherence, the meticulous ceremonies, the scrupulous law-keeping,
it was inversely proportional to its inward spiritual life.
exactly, its capacity for love, for humility, for true perspective.
So the ultimate rejection of the Savior wasn't some sudden, tragic mistake on one specific day.
Not at all. It was the predictable, I'd say inevitable, conclusion of 1,000 years of chasing worldly greatness, allowing ceremony to replace substance, and letting self-interest distort the very message they were meant to safeguard.
They were ready for a Caesar, but they were utterly unprepared for the humility of the Son of God.
And the very complex system of laws and precepts they created to preserve the faith, that became the impenetrable barrier that prevented them from recognizing the central figure the faith was all about. It's a chilling lesson in institutional blindness.
It is indeed. And it brings us back to our own time, reflecting on what we prioritize in our own lives or institutions. If the multiplication of ceremony and rigid rules without a corresponding increase in love and spiritual humility leads to apathy and rejection, then we have to ask ourselves a tough question.
We do.
How do we ensure today that our own adherence to forms or rules, whether they're religious, institutional, or even social, doesn't become a barrier preventing us from seeing what truly matters and responding to the genuine purpose behind our efforts? That's something for you to mull over as we conclude this deep dive.